Assalamu alaikum. So this is our third class for Al-Bayan. And it's been interesting so far, I think. I think our first class we talked about finding our purpose. Our second class we delved a little more deeply into the communication concepts that we can use on an organizational level, public speaking, and also on an interpersonal level, connecting with others. I gave you an extra packet last week that looked like this. Let's see if I have to find it. That had some activities in it. Yeah, this one. So yeah, this is the one. Okay. So were any of you able to finish the activities that were in here? Everyone looks down. No one did their homework.
I did.
Did
But
you?
it was all guessing.
It was all guessing. Okay. All right. Guessing is good as long as you did it. See? No, we will actually go over some of it in the end. And I want to actually talk briefly about the article that I had in here for you to read. But
I thought it was confusing.
The article is supposed to be confusing, yes. And I'll tell you why. And we'll talk a little bit about it as we continue. But today's topic is actually one that is, I feel, is incredibly important and something that's very near and dear to my heart, because we're going to talk about interpersonal relationships on a more micro level, and particularly the topic of marriage. So, and those of you who know me know that's kind of the thing I love talking about. So, so we're going to delve a little bit into how we as individuals can work on ourselves, better our communication skills, to better our relationships, and particularly with the close relationship of our spouses. Is everyone here married? Yes? Okay. Oh, wonderful. Good. So I'm glad my students aren't here. So we'll gear it all towards people who are married, and we'll focus on that direction. I actually picked up with the slides, though, where we left off last week, because we ran out of time last week to cover all of the slides in your packet. So I figured I'd just pick up with the last slide that we ended with, and then move forward from there. So the last slide in last time's topic, we ended with the facial slide, the one where we looked at the facial movements and how different our reactions can be, and how the minor facial movements can change the meaning of what it is that we're actually projecting, and how important it is for us to be aware of what our nonverbals are sending, what messages they're sending. So the next step in that was looking at our credibility. Sometimes, we were talking about low pitch and high pitch speakers, and sometimes you meet a person and you just feel that person is so sincere. You feel like you believe everything that person says, whether or not that person is sincere, but you just get that feeling. And often that's because they have a very high credibility level. Okay? So whenever you're speaking to someone, and how long did we say it takes to make a first impression? 2 seconds. Okay, fraction of a second, right? The amount of time that your eyes process what they see and send a message to the brain, right? So we have 3 chances when we're trying to give off a signal of credibility, right? We have initial credibility, derived credibility, and terminal credibility. Our initial credibility has to do with the exercise that we did last week. When I walked out of the door and I walked back in and I walked out, how we present ourselves in those first fraction of the second, right? What does it mean? What is the visual transmission that's being sent to people, and how are they interpreting it? Okay? Our derived credibility comes from when we speak. Okay? So a lot of times you'll hear someone speaking, for example, if you've ever gone to buy a car, and you hear someone speaking and you're just like, wow, he knows so much about this car, right? And a lot of times it's not that the salesperson knows so much more than you about the car, but they're able to present the information that they know in a way that appeals to you and connects to you. So for example, I remember when I was I was pregnant with my second child, we were looking for a car. And I decided to go into a car place and then just look around, even though Hamdi, my husband, had said, don't go without me. But I'm like, no, it's okay, I'm just looking, right? And I walked into a dealership, and there was a guy who was there who, as soon as he met me, said, oh, you're looking for a car, this is great. And he said, I'm sure it's hard. I was carrying my little one, I think, in my hand, and I was expecting. And he was like, oh, it's hard being a mom, juggling this. And immediately I felt like he had very high credibility, right? And it wasn't what he was saying, it was how he was saying it. And the way that he connected with me, saying things like, oh, your daughter is so beautiful, and I'm sure, your next child is going to be just as cute, and, and tell me about your day. It was like a therapy session. It was great, So by the end of that day, I walked out with a Mitsubishi Outlander and $20,000 less in our bank account. Hamdi was not pleased.
I would think
yes. So Mitsubishi Outlander, if you've ever seen a Mitsubishi Outlander, it's a hideous car. So it lasted about 3 weeks, and then Hamdi's like, we're getting rid of this. So the point point was that I was taken in by this person's assumed credibility, by the initial, the derived, and the terminal credibility. He set it up initially with his nonverbals. He was able to sell me the car before he even opened his mouth. When he looked at me and he looked like he knew what I was going through and he felt my pain, having that connection was the first step of winning someone over. And then his derived credibility, when he talked about, he didn't tell me about, the horsepower of the car or I know nothing about cars, so like the steering power. He didn't talk about that. Instead, he sat there telling me, well, it's important for your children to be safe, and God forbid if you ever got into an accident, this car right here would save them and would make sure that nobody was hurt. And I was like, oh, wow, that's exactly what I'm looking for. So his derived credibility was built again on how well he knew me, on how well he knew what to say to attract me. And his terminal credibility was the final credibility, which was in clinching the sale, of course, and being able to convince me that I was doing what was best for me and my family at that point, even though it obviously was not. So how do we translate this, or how do we look at it from an Islamic perspective? We know that one of the things that we need to be careful of and wary of as Muslims is the fear of being from the munafiqeen, the hypocrites. Okay? And a lot of times the hypocrites are those who on the face seem to be so kind, so loving, so sweet, so reaching out to you, but on the inside they actually have ulterior motives. Okay? And we talked in the very first session about النية, إنما الأعمال بالنيات, that our actions are but by intentions. And so it's important that we as individuals always clarify our intentions, so that when we're even trying to sell something, and I use the car example, but really every day of our lives we're trying to sell something. We're selling who we are as people, essentially, whether it's with our bosses at work or with our spouses at home. A lot of times the human nature is that we want people to like us. We want people to accept us. We want to have that feeling of approval. And sometimes we can find ourselves caught into that trap of thinking too much about the approval, thinking too much or seeking too much of the appeasement of the people, and forgetting who we're really supposed to be appeasing, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course. So it's always important for us to keep that first and foremost. When we talk about credibility, to think of, is what I'm doing here for the dunya or for the akhirah? Is the credibility that I'm trying to set forth here really something that's going to benefit me long term, or does it have short term needs? Okay? So how do we do that? The best or the most important way to avoid falling into that trap or that pit of hypocrisy is to avoid logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are essentially like tricks of the mind. And the best salespeople out there can usually use logical fallacies to their best interest. We see it in advertisements all the time. So for example, some of the logical fallacies: red herring, slippery slope, bandwagon, either or, ad hominem, or straw man. If you look at a slippery slope fallacy, for example, if someone says something to you, for instance, if we don't kill all the terrorists, then the world is going to be over. Okay? That's a very slippery slope type of a logic. Okay? It's intended to induce fear. It's intended, which the media is filled with, of course. And the media uses logical fallacies all the time because it's a quick and easy way to work inside our minds, okay? To get us to believe something and to think that there is credibility there when there may not be any real credibility there. Okay? A red herring. The red herring fallacy is the idea, it's a diversion tactic. So making us think of something else in order to avoid the problem or the issue at hand. And the reason why it's called a red herring fallacy is that back in the days when people used to ride horses, there was a sport where the hounds would run after the foxes, and then the lords would come on their horses running after the hounds. And the farmers got very upset because the foxes would run through their crops, and then the hounds would come after the foxes running through the crops, and then the horses would come after that, and the crops would be trampled. So the farmers took a red herring, which was a very stinky fish, and ran it around the perimeter of their crops. So once the fox ran through the crops, the hound would lose the scent of the fox and would go around the crops and lead the horse around the crops rather than through the crops. Okay? See, the best technology we have today couldn't even do that, right? So that it developed into what we call today the red herring fallacy, which is the idea of diverting someone's attention to something else. Again, we see it in the media all the time. So you can see, for example, there's many examples, but the Benghazi trials, for example. If anyone remembers the Benghazi trials, does anyone remember what came about just when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was about to be questioned about the Benghazi situation and how much she knew and whether or not she knew that the U.S. ambassador was in trouble? What happened? Does anyone remember? No. Okay. General Petraeus, who was the director of the CIA at the time, was suddenly charged with all of these accusations. He was having his biographer, who was a 30-year-old woman, and he was like 75 or something. Apparently it was said that he was doing haram things with her, and because of that he had leaked information, and suddenly it was all over the news. Because as soon as the people in the US kind of hear something like this, a scandal, everyone's eyes are on it. And oh my gosh, what happened? How could he do that? And and it was a great diversion tactic. Because guess what? Everyone stopped asking about what happened in Benghazi, whether or not Secretary of State Hillary Clinton knew anything. It just kind of quietly went away. It came back again later, but with a different impact, And that's an example of a red herring fallacy. And that's an example of something that's unethical, but that happens all the time. And that when we're trying to be the truest form of ourselves, when we're trying to connect who we are with our purpose, it's so important to avoid falling into these things. Bandwagon, of course, is when everyone's doing it, so why wouldn't I do it too, And this happens, I see it in the high school all the time, of course, Well, everyone's on this site, everybody's going to this party, why wouldn't I go too? And again, it pulls us away from really sitting with ourselves and asking ourselves, is this pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Okay? Ad hominem is the attack on the person rather than on the issue. And either or, we're actually going to talk about in a little bit with another example. And straw man is when you blame someone else who has nothing to do with anything at all in order to take the eyes away from you. So it's similar to the diversion tactic. All right, the next slide that I had in last week's packet was the VARC slide, understanding different communication styles. We all learn differently, we all communicate differently. So some of us tend to be more visual learners, some of us tend to be more oral, listening, some appreciate things when they're read or in writing, and some are kinesthetic, which is movement, okay? We use this in the classroom, but we also use it in day-to-day life, in understanding how we can connect with people. And this is incredibly important in building up our own credibility. Knowing who we're talking to and whether or not that person would find what we're saying more acceptable or more approachable depending on their communication style. Okay? I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because we have so much that I want to do today, but we will get back to it maybe in the last session if we have time. All right, so along with different communication styles in terms of understanding and connecting, one of the biggest differences I think that we have is our gender. And trying to navigate the realm of gender communication is incredibly fascinating. When our kids are young, and do you all have kids here?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, what's the age ranges, if you don't mind me asking?
I have 2, 6, and 8.
Okay, you forgot for a minute there, I don't know. He's like, I don't know, do I have kids? Okay, 2, 6, and 8, okay, mashallah. Dr. Muhammad?
8 to 24.
Mashallah, 8 to 24, that's a nice range, okay.
10, 9, 5.
10, 9, and 5.
I have twins, 10-year-olds.
Twin 10-year-olds, mashallah.
15, 17.
15 and 17. Okay, so there's different age ranges here, and we'll probably touch upon parenting in the next session. But from when our children are young, we can tell right away that boys are different than girls. They're different in the way they communicate. They're different in the way that they interact. They're different in a lot of the things that they do. But somehow, as we get older and we enter our relationships, particularly our marriage relationships, we tend to forget this huge difference. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us differently, not only biologically, but psychologically as well. And you could argue it's nature versus nurture, it's society that decides. I personally believe that we're really created differently, that there is something in our biological makeup that lends to our physiological and our psychological reactions to things. One of the first examples that we see in communication differences between genders is the way that we listen. Okay? Usually, women tend to be more empathy-oriented in the way they listen, and men tend to be more action-oriented. What does that mean? I'll give you an example. So back many years ago, when I was first married, when I had, my kids were still young, And I had one of those mornings. It was a morning where the kids spilled the milk, and I couldn't find the shoe, and the book bag was missing. Hamdi had already left earlier for work, and I was running late. So I finally got to work, after dropping off the kids, and my husband called me. And he's like, how was your day? And so I told him, well, this morning was so stressful. I couldn't find the shoe, and the milk spilled, and the book bag was missing. And he was like, well, you should lay out the shoes the night before, and you should pour the milk earlier in the morning. You should prepare the lunches, get up an hour ahead of time. And I started crying. I'm like, and he was like, what's wrong? And I'm like, you called me a bad mother. And I hung up with him. And then a little while later, a friend of mine called, and she heard in my voice that I didn't sound good, and she's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, well, the milk spilled, and the shoe, and the book bag, and the kids, and I'm late, and she was like, well, you know what, you're doing a great job. Don't worry about it. It's gonna be okay. I was like, thank you. And I felt a little better. So I hung up the phone, went through the day, and then I went home that day. And alhamdulillah, Hamdi had bought flowers. He didn't know what he did wrong, but he did buy flowers. And he was like, I don't get it. What did I do wrong? And I tried to explain to him that when I was telling him my problem, I didn't need him to give me a list of what to do. I just wanted him to tell me it was okay. I wanted him to give me a hug, And I tried to explain that to him, and he couldn't understand because he's like, you had a problem, I gave you a solution. It's like a perfect transaction. Here's A, there's B. Where did we go wrong? So a few weeks later, I remember Hamdi was sitting and he was like, oh, the Macy's bill is a little high. And I was like, do you want a hug? And, he wasn't amused. But the point is that we are different and our communication style is different. But when we get into our relationships with our spouses, sometimes we can't work upon those differences. And those differences can sometimes mean the breakup of a relationship. And that's what it really saddens me sometimes when I have couples who are coming in where on the surface they feel like they're so incompatible. But in reality, it's these little things that go into becoming more competent communicators that are missing in the relationship. And of course, personality differences play a role. But even with the personality differences, oftentimes it's difficult to find the balance, but it's something that needs to be done. So we talked the first class a little bit about I think it was last class actually, about the importance of the visual and how we make our judgments within those first few seconds, or the fraction of a second, based on what we see. Right? And without a doubt, that's very important within relationships as well, because we do make our decisions based on what we see. And what we see can often inform what our reaction is going to be. So that if someone comes home from work and says, how was your day? Okay, and the response is kind of like, fine. Immediately that's sending a negative message out there. And so often the response of the spouse will be something like, well, you have no idea, my day was so hard. It's almost like it becomes a competition of whose day was harder, whose day was more difficult. Right? And we know that Rasulullah has told us, the best of you is the best to your family, and I am the best to my family. And a lot of times we forget this, we don't come home with that best smile for our family. We don't come home with that nicest look or that kindest demeanor for our family. And that can often take away from the relationship as well. All right, another difficulty that we often see in relationships and also in understanding our gender roles and who we are and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from us in our gender roles, in trying to navigate what society expects from us in our gender roles. Unrealistic expectations. So this picture was relevant maybe like 3 years ago. I know my daughter's always like, Mom, nobody even knows who that is anymore. But these were Edward and Bella from the Twilight series. You know who they are. Okay, good. This concept of sitting in a field and looking into each other's eyes and being rescued by the handsome prince or vampire in this case, whatever the case may be. It's an expectation that subconsciously we have taken into our own minds. Even if we think on a surface, no, I know that's not true. Right? But when we have media and movies and books and messages all around us, always telling us this, like this right here, this is love, this is marriage, this is what makes a couple, it becomes really hard to tear ourselves away from that and step back and say, no, this isn't, you know? And especially, you know, if you watch Bollywood movies, you get the impression that, you know, life is all about singing and, you know, stopping in the marketplace and swishing your sari around, you know? That's not what life is, you know? And it's something that's sometimes difficult for us to remind ourselves of. Because when you've got things like that, the grass often looks greener on the other side. So I ended the last slides with the ayah from Surah Al-Rum, and I just want to go through the translation of these two ayahs to talk about actually the article that was in the packet and a little more about this topic. So the ayah, the first ayah from Surah Al-Rum that I pulled up there, ayah 21, is known as the marriage ayah. It's the ayah that you'll often see the verse on top of wedding cards. You'll see it in most places related to the wedding. It's read in the beginning of every nikah. And the translation of it is, and of his signs is that he created for you from yourselves mates, that you may find tranquility in them. And he placed between you affection and mercy. Indeed, in that are signs for people who give thought. And the ayah that follows, that isn't always included on the marriage cards, is, and of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, that are signs for those of knowledge. I'm just going to go back to the Arabic again for a moment. So first, when we look at the first ayah from Surah Al-Rum here, the ayah 21, we see a couple of things that sometimes we don't pay as much attention to maybe as we should. You know, oftentimes when we get the verse on the wedding card, we kind of skip right through it and go straight to, you know, what we think is the important stuff. Where is the wedding taking place? What time? Am I going to choose fish or chicken? You know, the things that we deem as important. But when we really look at the ayah and we reflect upon it, we get a better view of what marriage is supposed to be and how far it is from that unrealistic expectations that we had up there. So we see that the word that is used, for example, in describing what the marriage relationship is litaskunu. And the word litaskunu, if you look at it, it comes from the root word of sukun. Okay? And sukun, when we're reading the Quran, if you're looking at the tajweed, when you see a sukun, what do? You stop, right? And when we look at the ayah, we see that our marriages are supposed to be that stop, that place of rest, that place where we find tranquility and serenity, not by being crazy and running around and seeing fireworks all the time, but by resting, by finding that connection with a spouse that brings that rest into our heart, that brings that tranquility into our heart. Of course, the mawadda and rahmah, the care and the mercy, is something else that's so important that we see in this ayah, that developing that care and mercy. And oftentimes our marriages will start out that way. You know, in the honeymoon phase, in those early times, you know, we have that care and mercy. We feel that our spouse really is looking out for us, you know, and on both sides, for the male and the female. But somewhere along the line, a lot of times, we lose sight of that. And it's because life gets very busy, and we lose that sense of rest, and we bring the insanity of life into our marriages as well. Now, when you look at the last part of the ayah, we see that it says, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَةٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. In that is an ayah. An ayah is a miracle or a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Marriage itself, when it works, it's a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's amazing to think that you're taking two people from completely different backgrounds, from completely different upbringings, from completely different families, and you're putting them together, and they're living together with mawadda wa rahmah. They're developing this sakina, this tranquility within their marriage, within their home. And that is an ayah. And I think we don't reflect enough upon the ayah, the beauty of the relationship. When we look at the ayah that follows, and again, it's a verse that often we'll discuss the marriage ayah, the ayah 21, but we don't look at the verse that's right after it. And the verse that's after it says, and of his signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, in that are signs for those of knowledge. Okay? So again, the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks to us about marriage and then follows it up with an ayah that talks about diversity and the differences in our language, the differences in our colors, it's enough for us to reflect on how important it is to have that diversity, and also on why today we see so many couples where parents will say, I don't want you marrying someone from this ethnicity, I don't want you marrying someone from this culture, and how this is not part of our deen, this is not part of our faith. Now the article that I gave you in the packet yesterday, the article that the brother had said was pretty confusing. Why don't you tell us briefly what you thought the article was about? You're like on the spot now, I
No,
know.
it wasn't like about like some people their society is like the hunting and gathering.
Mhm.
This what they say was like market oriented kind of
Okay.
society, was a little bit I guess developed society.
Okay.
But they said that they spend still a lot of time in their religious practices.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go about like one was like a healing person.
Okay.
Even though everybody in society know that he doesn't do no healing at all.
Uh-huh.
But they still went there and they have to interesting aspect was like they have to pay him
Yes,
before
yeah.
they go in.
They did.
And even afterward they have to pay him again.
Uh-huh.
It was funny.
So what did you think about that? Like, what did that make you think of that culture?
I get this like everybody's doing it, so they feel like it's like a norm. I guess we have to do it,
Okay.
even though everybody. The funny thing is, even if you die, what happens then? Like
Okay.
yeah,
And then they still keep going.
still keep going.
Okay, good. So the article talked about a tribe called the Nasarima. Okay, and it was an article that was written in the 1950s, right? And it described this tribe as a group, and take some time to read the article because it's very interesting to reflect on what's in the article. It talks about this tribe or these people as being obsessed with their appearance. It talks about how they take bundles of hog hairs and put some magic potion on it and rub it in their mouth, thinking that people will like them more.
Or the teeth one.
The teeth one, right. It talks about how how this tribe will visit a place called the Latipso, where they will seek treatment for their physical ailments, but most of them will never leave the Latipso alive. And in the Latipso, they'll be put with like needles and they'll be pricked and they'll look for these ointments and these magical potions. It also talks about the obsession within the home of how this tribe has like certain shrines where they'll mix some magical fluids together and they'll spend a great deal of time inside these shrines. Okay? So when you were done reading it, what did you think? Were you just like, these people are weird, or what did you think?
No, I didn't say weird, but it's just that it's like, do the people like this really exist?
Okay,
We
do
don't
people
know
like
about
this
it.
really exist? Okay, and that's a question that's often asked when this article is read. However, I want you to read the name of the tribe backwards.
Oh, what?
The tribe that was being described there is actually the Americans, okay? And the place that they go to is actually, if you read it backwards, what is it?
Oh
A hospital.
Hospital.
Now, the way that the article describes it makes it incredibly fascinating and very different, okay? And there is a little bit of like crinkling of the nose as you read it, thinking like, this is a little strange, why do they do these strange practices? It talks about women baking their heads in round ovens in order to get their hair to look perfect. And if you remember, and this was written in the 1950s, women when they go to the beauty salon and they put and it's really hot in there, and they still exist, yes. And it talks about all of these almost sadistic like treatments that people do to themselves. And you would think
I was
like, this
thinking
is
about Malcolm X
awful.
kind of movie when they would put something, to color it or something,
Straighten
make it
it.
straighten up, like a
Yes,
browning and
yes,
put it there.
yes, yes. And when you're outside of the culture and you're looking in, it seems very strange. It seems so unfamiliar. But then when you realize that they're talking about us, you're just like, oh wait, the view is different though. And it's funny, I used to have, I don't know if I have it in my classroom or not, but I used to have stacks of National Geographic magazines. And I'd hold them up to my students and they'd always comment and be like, oh, that face looks so strange. Because National Geographic loves the exotic, right? So they'll take a picture of a tribal dance and they'll put it on the cover. And then everyone will think, oh, this tribe is, always dresses like this, or they always dance like this. There was an issue of the National Geographic once that featured the Wadobe tribe. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Wadobe tribe. They made a movie about them actually called The Air Up There. The Wadobe tribe was the last untouched tribe, essentially, until National Geographic went in. But they were the last untouched tribe in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea?
I don't know.
I can never say it right, but yeah.
Papua New Guinea.
Yes, there you go. They were like by the Aboriginals, like off of an island off of New Zealand, I think, the coast of New Zealand. And in that tribe, there was a different view of gender relations. Okay, so women were considered functional, and men were considered beautiful. Okay, so men would do things such as they would shave their hair and draw a line from as far back on their forehead as they can to the tip of their nose, because the longer a man's nose, the more beautiful he was considered. Okay, they would dye their lips black, because the whiter a man's teeth, the more beautiful he was considered. Okay? And if they dyed their lips black, they would also look like they had whiter teeth. Also, red eyes were considered very attractive. So they would use some kind of a liquid from the leaves to put it in their eyes that would burn their eyes to make them look very red. Okay? Now again, we're thinking like, ew, that's so disgusting, why would they do that? But in reality, when we look at our own regimens sometimes here in the US, we pierce our babies' ears when they're first born, even though they're screaming in discomfort and pain, right? As teens get older, suddenly they want nose piercings and all other sorts of piercings, and we do a lot of these things also to adhere to our definition of beauty. And in the Wadobi tribe, they also, the women will choose the husband. So often what they'll do is once a year, the men perform a special dance. And the man who is able to hold his eyes cross-eyed the longest is considered the most attractive of the men. And he's the one that's married off first, And again, if we think back to our own cultures and our own ways of acting, sometimes we do things like this as well. And we don't question it because we've gotten so used to it. Okay? And with the Wadobi tribe, as I said, unfortunately, after the National Geographic published that issue, many people decided to go visit the Wadobi because they thought it was such a fascinating culture, and they completely corrupted them. But an interesting fact, one person went to the Wadobi tribe with a magazine with a picture of Americans on Halloween. Okay? And the cover was the picture of an American with like a Frankenstein kind of mask on his face, and they asked the Wadobi, what do you think of the Americans? And they're like, they're crazy, because that's all they saw, that's all they could go on. So it's important that we recognize, even when it seems different, even when it's not what we're used to, even within our own homes, with our own spouses, and with our children. Okay? Because as our children are growing up in society today, it's almost like a whole new culture. It's almost like Nasarima to us, because it seems so unfamiliar, what they're going through and what they're experiencing. Right? But always recognizing that just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong, unless it's going against the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That our compass that should guide us always is this pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And in that way, we're always going back and checking and seeing, asking ourselves, asking our children, asking our spouses, and hopefully setting our compass to navigate us in the right way, inshallah. Okay, so speaking of pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the next topic that I want to talk about in terms of gender relations and gender interactions is something I think that's very relevant to us. Last week, we spent a little more time than I had intended on a topic that came up in conversation, which I was just going to say in passing, but got a little interesting, about handshaking. Okay? And I'm not going to open it up again because that's one that it's an interesting topic. And again, I know it's something that, living in this country, many people find it very difficult. But again, as long as we understand what it is that is expected of us from an Islamic perspective, I think that's very important. And again, it goes back to always questioning our intentions. What are our intentions in what we do? And making sure that our actions align with our intentions, inshallah. So I put up here the pearl, the flower, and the candy because one of the most interesting topics I think that we are asked about often as Muslims, and particularly Muslim women, is the hijab. The way that a Muslim woman dresses, because the way that the media portrays a lot of times Muslim women dressing is either wearing the full niqab, wearing the burqa, wearing the hijab, although of course there's Muslim women in all colors, shapes, sizes, and wearing modest in different ways. Within our own community, sometimes we try to explain the dress of the Muslim woman or the protection and the modesty of the Muslim woman by drawing human analogies. And a lot of times these human analogies do more damage than good. So I cannot tell you how many lectures I've heard where often a male scholar is speaking and he says, the woman is like the pearl. She must be protected because she is in the shell and the pearl is inside the shell, in the ocean, under the sand. And that's why Muslim women should cover. And when we try to understand hijab in that way, it's not at all according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us. The flower is another thing. The Muslim woman is like the flower. She can only bloom for her husband, and otherwise, she has to be covered. Again, it doesn't even make sense as a human analogy a lot of times. And the most recent one that I heard that I thought was pretty interesting was the candy. The example of the covered candy and the uncovered candy. That if you had two lollipops and one had a cover and one did not have a cover and you threw them both on the floor and then you picked them up, which one would you want? The one that was uncovered with all the flies on it or the one that was covered? And I know we laugh about this, but these are actual analogies that are used sometimes to try to explain the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And again, if we don't fully understand it and comprehend it, it becomes very difficult for us to try to share that information with anyone else. Forget people outside, but with our own children even. And in trying to send the message of what modesty means, what hayat means, and how we can live it on a day-to-day basis. Another example that I saw online actually, which I thought was interesting, related to men and modesty. And it said that if you had two kiwis, right, and one kiwi had, the furry hair on it, and the other kiwi was peeled, and you threw them both on the ground, and you picked up the one without the hairy outside, which one would you want? The one that was covered. And this is why Muslim men wear beards, right? And again, it doesn't even make sense, right? But these are actual analogies that are perpetuated online and in lectures sometimes. And I think it's important for us to go back to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about gender and to understand how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala views the man and the woman. And also to talk a little bit about the modesty and the expectations of the modesty as we understand it in Islam. So last week, actually, I thought it was very timely, but we didn't get to it last week. Abdurrahman Haggag, who was here, led us in Salah. And the ayah that he actually used, one of the ayahs that he used, was an ayah from Surah Al-Ahzab. It's an ayah that I want to talk about today, because it's an ayah that talks about what it means to be a Muslim man and what it means to be a Muslim woman. So the ayah begins, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن المسلمين والمسلمات والمؤمنين والمؤمنات والقانتين والقانتات والصادقين والصادقات والصابرين والصابرات والخاشعين والخاشعات والمتصدقين والمتصدقات والصائمين والصائمات والحافظين فروجهم والحافظات والذاكرين الله كثيرا والذاكرات أعد الله لهم مغفرة وأجرا عظيما. Indeed, the Muslim man and the Muslim women, the believing man and the believing women, the obedient man and the obedient women, the truthful man and the truthful women, the patient man and the patient women, the humble man and the humble women, the charitable man and the charitable women, the fasting man and the fasting women, the men who guard their chastity and the women who do so, and the men who remember Allah often and the women who do so. For them, Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. So we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Ahzab that both men and women will be judged based on the merit of their deeds. That the men who believe and the women who believe, the men who fast, the women who fast, the men who are truthful, the women who are truthful, the men who are patient, the women who are patient, will all have the same reward in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's really a matter of understanding how our gender roles are defined in Islam and what the expectation from an Islamic viewpoint is for each of us in our gender. What does it mean for the man to be charitable and for the woman to be charitable? What does it mean for the man to guard his chastity and for the woman to guard her chastity? What does it mean for the man to remember Allah often and the woman to remember Allah often? Okay? And by understanding what the expectations are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, hopefully we can work on ourselves and improve to meet those expectations and to try to avoid the pull that sometimes society has on us in pulling us away to expectations or definitions that don't go with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to do. Alright, so I'm going to move a little bit forward here, that one of the things that we see often with our youth and with us, honestly, where we understand our roles. Again, sometimes it's subconsciously, but oftentimes our first exposure to what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman starts as early as, Disney days, trying to see what the definition of media and society is giving us as to what it means to be in a certain role. And of course, we see the evolution of Disney even today. When Cinderella first came out, I think also 1950s, 1960s, 70s maybe. It was a while ago. It was a long time ago. Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. The concept of the female was one who was very docile, one who was obedient, one, now not obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, obedient to the people around her, okay? One who would silently, kind of take what was given to her, right? And we see that as time has changed, the roles of the Disney princesses have changed, and society has responded to that as well. Now, we talked, I think, on the first day, I believe I had mentioned it, the theory of sociolinguistic relativity, which sounds a lot bigger than it really is. Essentially, it says that our world is shaped by the words that we use. Okay? And if we choose to use words in a certain way, it'll change the way we view the world. So, for example, a few years ago, when I was growing up, in the schoolyard, when we'd be playing, we would say, oh, what a happy day, I am so gay. And we used to say, that was a song we used to sing, And the word gay had a completely different connotation as to what it says today. If any child tried to do that in the playground, even here at Nur al-Iman, I don't think that would be a good idea, because the word means something different. Does it mean that the act didn't exist, or the relationship model didn't exist back then? With this theory, the idea is that the word helped bring it into existence. It gave it relevance and importance, right? And it made it a thing, So for example, when you look at the word snow, how many words do we have to describe snow here in the US? A few. We've got like maybe 5 or 6. We've got like snow, sleet, hail. Yeah. If you go to Alaska and you study the Inuit language in Alaska, they have 367 words to describe snow. So they have a word to describe, snow when it's wet. They have a word to describe snow after a reindeer stepped in it. They have a word to describe snow after a reindeer pooped in it. They have they have so many words for snow. So does that mean we don't have all that snow? Or does it just mean that that snow is not important enough for us to bring it into existence? Okay? So the idea is that our language and the words that we choose to describe things can help create that reality. And we see the same thing in the transition from gender roles and gender views as we move through society and we look at what media hands us often to define gender roles. Stop me at any time if you have questions or there's anything you want to go through, or I know everybody's tired, so I'm not going to take up the whole time today. I see yawns and so I know it's a Monday night. Do you guys want to stop at Maghrib time, or do you want to continue after Maghrib? Do you want me to wrap up at 8:30 and then
No, continue.
continue? Is it okay? Okay. But I really won't be offended if you're tired and you need to leave. It's okay, okay? I know it's a long day. Alright, so I pulled up the ayahs from Surah An-Nur, which are the ayahs of modesty. And I pulled them up for the reason that it's probably, again, one of the top questions that we get as Muslims from non-Muslims is, why do women have to cover and men don't? Why do women have so many restrictions in Islam and men don't? Why do women accept this oppression and men don't? And so I pulled up the ayahs from Surah An-Nur because I think, again, it's important for us as Muslims to understand the commandment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you look at the ayahs, it's important to distinguish that the first ayah in Surah An-Nur that commands modesty is a commandment that comes directed towards the men. And then the second ayah is directed towards the women. So the first ayah says, tell the believing men to reduce some of their vision and guard their private parts. That is pure for them. Indeed, Allah is acquainted with what they do. So remember from Surah Al-Ahzab, again, both men and women will receive the same reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for obeying Allah. But it's so important that we recognize what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking of us as women and us as men. So the commandment of modesty for men comes saying to reduce their vision and guard their private parts. And then the ayah for the women comes and tell the believing women to reduce some of their vision and guard their private parts and not expose their adornment except that which necessarily appears thereof, and to wrap a portion of their head covers over their chest and not expose their adornment except to their husbands, their husbands' fathers, and so on and so forth in terms of describing the mahram. Okay? So, what does that mean? And why are there always questions about modesty? And the question of, well, the Quran doesn't really say that a woman has to cover her head. And this is the question that we get a lot in the community, sometimes from Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think it's important to understand the context here, because we can never understand our deen in a vacuum without understanding the context as well. We see even prior to Islam, in the Jahiliyyah period, so the pre-Islamic period, we see that women of honor always had a veil over their head. So we'll see pictures that are painted, for example, of, as the Catholics call her, the Virgin Mary. Of course, we know her Sittina Maryam. But all the pictures that have her, she has a veil thrown over her head, but her chest is often uncovered. Okay? So prior to the revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, women were often covering their head anyway. But the chest was uncovered and they were wearing clothes that was often see-through, or that was the body outline could be seen. And we know that even prior to Islam, there was a slave woman who had left the home once with a cover on her head, a veil, and she was beaten because it was said that that was only something of honor for women of status. When the ayahs were revealed, all believing women, regardless of their status, were told, you are honorable. You have to cover your head, or you should cover your head, because you deserve that honor. And today we see at weddings, brides of all faiths will wear a veil, you know. And when you ask brides who wear the white veil, why are you wearing the veil? Like, I don't know, you know, it's just something I do. But the reality is you can trace the origins of the veil to be a symbol of honor for women from way before the advent of Islam. So the ayah simply told women to pull that head covering to cover their chests, right? But it was always in place, yes.
So does that almost mean that, you know, the holy books that were sent down before the Quran, because history before Islam, we know that it was a fact, right? Covering up the head. Does that maybe have to do with the fact that it was related to the holy books before the Quran? That was the message somewhere, culturally, through those messages, through those holy books, that it just became a part of society?
That it was just done, it was something that was
just
done.
Because that message was given
In
through
holy books,
Allah beforehand?
And you know, Allah Alam, because it's hard to go back to find, I mean, we'll
Yes,
never
sources,
find
right.
a Bible or a Torah
Right.
that's in its original
Right,
form, because
right.
they have been changed. You know? We know that the one message that was consistent throughout all of the prophets from Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam was La ilaha illallah. There is but one God. You know, that there's only one God. And that is the message that every prophet preached, you know, consistently. Okay? Whether or not the mandate of hijab was in the previous books, that's something like I can't speak to that. I don't know if Dr. Muhammad can speak to that at all.
No,
But-
I can't. The only thing I can say is, how did the women companions of the Prophet
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
that history we know very well in details.
Yeah.
How did those women dress? How did they behave in front
Right,
of
carry
the Messenger
themselves.
ﷺ? How did he talk to them and so forth? That's where we take our deen
Yes.
from.
Yeah.
So if we have an evidence that says, well, Sayyidatuna Fulana was completely uncovered while talking to Rasulullah
Sallallahu
sallallahu
alaihi wasallam.
and he said nothing, that would be an evidence, but I don't
Yeah,
believe we have that.
We don't have
Right,
that.
right.
So-
No.
Yes, we can trace back that all deens, the roots of all these, what we call divine religions, come from Allah, and all these prophets are from Allah. And in fact, Rasulullah said that all us prophets are brothers. Our religion is one, right? Dinuna wahid.
Yes, yes.
Kulluna min, right? So, yeah, you can trace it, but to the details of hijab, I'm
Yeah.
not sure we
I
can.
think it's just interesting that before Islam, women were covering up.
Yes.
And that's why it piques your interest
Yes.
that, you know what, it could be related
Yeah.
to a divine message from before Islam. And that's why
I think it would
was
be
part
really
of
interesting to
society.
study even, I mean, even to look at, you know, the versions of the Bible that they have today. There may be something, and I'm not well versed in the Bible, although it's something like on my list of things I want to do. Like I'd like to read through the King James Version in particular, just to understand. I think sometimes we spend a lot of time trying to understand our own faith, when it's important for us to know other faiths as well, so that we can, and I don't think it ever weakens us in our faith,
Oh,
you
no,
know?
no, no.
I think when we were growing up, my parents were very hesitant. I remember I wanted to take a Hebrew class when I was in college, and my parents were like, oh, no, you know, why would you want a Hebrew class? And I remember, like, you know, and I was telling my parents, because in our Arabic class, you know, 75% of the students are actually Jewish students, you know, and I don't understand when you go to the Hebrew class, 100% are Jewish students, you know, there's no Muslim students over there. But there's always that fear that, you know, if you learn too much, but I think it's quite the opposite.
It
That
gives you perspective, it gives you
Yes.
reflection.
Yes,
It's very
yeah,
helpful.
yeah,
It will also enhance your capability of debating.
absolutely,
Usually they
absolutely.
get back to you with some of the big hype,
Yes.
or like the famous predictable, and this is give you tools to
Yeah.
come back and
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's beneficial for all of us that, you know, it's something that, like I said, it's something that's on my list of things that I'd like to do, to actually read it from cover to cover. I've read selections, but never the full thing. So I think it would be great, like, to look into that and then give me the answer, inshallah. Okay? Find out.
So the change that took place even in Christendom, right, the Christian world, it's really very recent, this removal of uncovering and, right?
It's like the 1920s is when it began.
If you go back to those pictures,
Yeah, yeah.
it's very interesting.
Yeah.
It is an oddity actually to see
Yes.
an uncovered
Yes,
woman, right?
absolutely. That's a great point, yeah.
Still, nuns still the highest
Yes.
honor of spirituality.
Yes,
Is still,
yeah. But it's interesting, yeah.
Aren't there churches where, traditional Christians
You have to
will
wear
just
a
for that
hat.
Sunday
Mhm.
church? they
Yes,
will
or
wear
a veil,
hat,
yep,
cover-
yes,
cover their
absolutely, yes.
hair.
Yeah. And I mean, even now the Hasidic Jewish women who wear the wig,
Yes.
they actually wear it as a covering of the hair,
Right.
but it evolved. They used to wear a scarf, and because they wanted to fit in with society, it turned into a hat, and then it turned into the wig. And a woman that I know, I think I mentioned her last week, the same woman who wouldn't shake the hand of that man, who's Hasidic Jewish, she was telling me, I feel sad when I see you because my faith used to be like that, where we would wear our veil very proudly. But she said, now everybody in my community wears the wig instead, and I feel like it's taken away from the modesty that we're supposed to have. And she said also the skirts used to be long to the ankles, but little by little they shortened them, and so now they just wear the black skirts that are to the knee instead of all the way down. So, and this is something I think it's an important lesson for us as well, and our own children in our tarbiyah, that making sure that we hold on to our faith. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us that there will come a day when holding on to your faith will be like holding on to a hot coal. And I think for many of us, we're living that now because we see a lot of these negotiations sometimes that we find ourselves, especially with the younger generation, kind of, that blurred lines, but not the kind like in the song, where we're trying to figure out not take away too much from them, but still give them just enough. And sometimes that's, again, this is parenting discussion was going to be next week, but it's trying to figure out that balance. And I think sometimes it comes from us too, that we sometimes have to strengthen our core first in order to be that model of strength for our children as well and for the community, inshallah.
Exactly, sister, this civic right that when somebody practices it,
Yeah.
it's becoming the subject of national discussion today, right?
Mhm.
The Supreme Court, today's news is what?
Yes,
Yeah.
alhamdulillah, yes. Did you
And
hear?
Yeah.
The woman who,
The United
Yes.
Airlines?
the Abercrombie and
No.
Fitch.
Abercrombie and Fitch.
Yes.
Oh, no, I did not
No,
read
today the
that.
Supreme Court
Mhm.
sided with the sister.
Yeah, it's been 3 years, I think, in the
Yes.
yeah.
She was told that she couldn't wear it
Yeah.
to work, and
She was fired from her job at Abercrombie and Fitch for wearing the hijab. Yeah, and so she won a case in the Supreme Court, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, saying that they couldn't discriminate against her because of her hijab. So alhamdulillah, that's
So you
it.
see, well, to get a topic like this at this level,
Yes,
absolutely.
even if you plan and you work hard, it doesn't get there.
That's the
Yes.
beauty of this
But
country.
this
though.
is, it's the beauty of the country because of the justice country.
yeah,
But it is also the power of Allah and the sincerity
sure.
of the system.
and the persistence. I
Persistence,
think
absolutely.
persistence too. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah.
Combination.
All right, so I think we'll break at 8:30 probably for Salah, so I'll just go through a few more slides. So I'm just kind of going through the evolution of the Disney princesses and what it said for us in terms of our gender relations and understanding. As the Disney princesses evolved in the late 80s, beginning 90s, I think Little Mermaid came out in 89, and the other one, Beauty and the Beast, came out in like 92, 93. But we saw that the model of Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, of the docile woman who just says yes to everything, began to change a little bit. Okay? And we started to hear a narrative of like Beauty and the Beast, who she was a reader, someone who loved books and constantly read. But still, there was this theme, this undercurrent of wait for your prince. The prince will come, even if he's a beast initially. Then he'll turn into this beautiful prince, and you'll get married. And the Little Mermaid began to send the message that it's okay to change who you are. And I don't know if you know the story of the Little Mermaid. If you have little girls, I'm sure you do. She trades in her mermaid tail for legs to become human so that she can be with the prince. Okay, and it began to have an undercurrent of you can change who you are in order to find that prince, to find that happily ever after. And again, even though we may not put a lot of emphasis on the Disney movies, the undercurrent is there, and it shapes society to a huge extent. And we see it today in a lot of couples who are trying to navigate the world today and understanding that balance between, what is my role in the home and what is my role outside of the home. I believe I mentioned, did I mention Sheryl Sandberg last week, the COO of Facebook?
No.
I remember that. Okay. I apologize. I give a lot of lectures in a lot of places, so I forget what I said to who. But she was in the news a couple of weeks ago, Sheryl Sandberg. She's the COO of Facebook. And many years ago, she was speaking at a commencement address in Barnard College. And Barnard is well known for, graduating powerful women who succeed in their careers. And in her commencement address, she said to the college graduates, she said, you may think that the most important step you're going to take in life is the career you choose or the job that you decide to take when you leave college. But the most important decision you'll make in your life is who you marry. Now, she said this, and the women at Bernard got very angry at her, and they said, we're not going to get married, why would you say that, and they got very upset at her. And so she wrote a book called Lean In, and in it she talked about the importance of having a spouse that supports you. And her husband was the founder of SurveyMonkey, and he was also a very high-tech internet type of person. And so in her book, she talked about the partnership of marriage, okay? But in her book, she also kept asking the question, what is the role of the woman? What should a woman do, Is a woman's role at home, or is she outside of the home? And many years before that, in 1950, a woman named Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And in it was considered very groundbreaking because she kept asking the question, what is the role of a woman? Is the role of a woman outside of the home or inside of the home? Now, it's very sad that a couple of weeks ago, Sheryl Sandberg's husband actually died very unexpectedly. They were on vacation in Mexico. They have 2 children, and he was on a treadmill exercising, and he slipped off the treadmill, and he hit his head, and I guess it was a brain aneurysm. Something happened where he died on the spot, and he was only 46 years old. And subhanAllah, this is, it's very eye-opening for us as Muslims because we always have this perspective. We're told that Rasulullah ﷺ tells us, be in the world like a stranger or a traveler. So we know this isn't our permanent abode. But sometimes we work in it and we struggle in it and we forget that the struggle is supposed to be here because this isn't Jannah. That if we didn't have the struggle here, we wouldn't have anything to work towards, because Jannah is where the perfection is, inshallah. And I think sometimes what causes a lot of difficulty in our relationships and a lot of stresses in our own life is constantly trying to navigate. We all have high stress jobs, I'm sure. We all have multiple things that we're juggling. We're all trying to figure out, to go back to our first session, figuring out how to best use our time. But again, if we really sit with ourselves and ask ourselves, what is the best way for me to use my time to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What is my purpose? What has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put me in this dunya for? It's to worship Allah. How can I best worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Everything falls into place, And sometimes we're so resistant to that as human beings. We're so afraid to step out of our box of our 9 to 5, our consistent, our schedule and our routine. But that's what our salah is for. In the first session we talked about the importance of our salah and holding on to it. But those moments of time where we're reflecting, where we're connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we're reminding ourselves of why we're here is so important to our well-being and to understanding what our roles are in our relationships and our lives. Alright, so today, these are the most modern Disney movies that we see today. The movie Brave was very interesting because in it was all about defiance. And in the movie, the young girl decides that she's angry at her mother because her mother wants her to get married, and she doesn't want to get married, and so she feeds her mom a cake or a potion that turns her mother into a bear. Okay? So the whole theme of the story is about defiance and be yourself, and you don't need a man in your life. Again, we see this theme repeated in society as well. So to go back to, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Are we humans the ones who are making the decisions and then media is reflecting it? Or is media helping us make those decisions and leading us towards that thought process? And I'm not someone to say, well, I hate Disney, I don't let my kids watch it. Actually, I love Disney, to be honest with you, because I think you can have a lot of great discussions. And we do watch the Disney movies, me and my children together, and we do stop and have discussions about it. And I remember after watching Brave, my youngest, at the time I think she was 5 or 6 years old, she turned to me and she said, that's not good, she's not listening to her mom, And it's important to have these kinds of conversations as well. And you can see Entangled here, this princess was a far cry from Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, who kind of sat silently by waiting for things to happen for them. Okay? So it's really important for us to stop and look at what society is telling us. Who society is telling us to be our role models, When I speak to the youth, often they'll get very excited and they'll be like, Lupe Fiasco is Muslim, or, Lindsay Lohan was holding a Quran last week, and then, maybe she's going to take Shahada, And yes, we need those types of models maybe in popular culture. And sometimes for youth in particular, it validates their thought process and their belief system. But at the same time, it's so important for us to remind our youth of the role models that our faith gives us, of who we can look to on a regular basis and try to bring them to life for our children as well. So, when I think of role models, for women, I think of Sittina Hawa, I think of Sittina Hajar, I think of Khadija and Aisha radiallahu anhum, and Sittina Maryam and Sittina Fatima. And these are the examples of role models that we can teach our children about as well. I think we talked last time, again I don't recall if we did or not, but about Sittina Hajar and the concept of striving, of the sa'i. Did we talk about it? I think we did. No? Maybe? First class, I think, yes. So yes, you'll have to look at the notes for the first class, okay? The concept of striving, of making dua, but having that tawakkul and that belief that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to protect you, but you have to do your part as well. And we see that with Sittina Maryam. And of course, if we're looking for strong-voiced women, if we're looking for women who have a voice and change the course of history, essentially, we look at Sittina Khadija, we look at Sittina Aisha radiallahu anhum. With Sittina Khadija radiallahu anha, I always use this narration, when I'm speaking about marriage, because really she was the quintessential wife who provided the support for her husband when he most needed it, and throughout the span of their marriage. So when we see that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after the year of sorrow, after the death of Sittina Khadija, when he was so affected, for years later, when he would hear the voice of her sister, like tears would spring to his eyes because he would remember Sittina Khadija radiallahu anha. And that's a love story. Why? Because when he first received the revelation, and he wasn't sure how to react to it, he wasn't sure what he was seeing. When he came down the mountain, his first thought was to go to his wife and tell her what he had seen. And then it was, in her lap, as he said, cover me, and he talked about what he saw. It was Sittina Khadija who comforted him and supported him and told him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never forsake you. You are good to your community. You are good to your family. Then surely this is a sign from Allah. And we know that it was Sittina Khadija that supported him throughout it. Now this is a woman that's a role model. How can we bring the lives of these women role models to life for our children? Sittina Aisha radiallahu anha was one of the foremost narrators of a hadith, a woman who was quick to learn things and quick to retain the knowledge and very eloquent in being able to bring it back to us. Sittina Fatima radiallahu anha, of course we know she had the nickname of Abiha, the mother of her father as she was growing up, because she cared so much for the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam that she would constantly look out for him. And we know that, for instance, when the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was praying once on a mountaintop, on a hilltop, she noticed from a distance, and she was about 11 or 12 years old, that the kuffar had surrounded him and they took the guts of a dead camel and were throwing it upon his back when he was praying. And so she went up the mountain and she kind of parted the way and removed the guts off the back of her father and sat down next to him as she cried. And when the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam completed his prayer, he didn't turn to her and yell at her and say, go back to the house, you're a woman, you shouldn't be here, you're a girl. No, he wiped her tears and he kissed her on the forehead and he said, do not cry, for surely Allah will allow your father to be victorious. And so he treated her with the respect that a lot of times we don't see today towards our daughters, towards our wives, towards our sisters. And sometimes we were missing that. And if we don't give them that same type of respect, that level of understanding and that validation at home, a lot of times they'll find it elsewhere. And I'm not just talking about our daughters, I'm talking about wives as well. That's something that we see consistently in the marriage counseling that we do.
Sister, just I want to reflect on
Yes.
the previous verse you brought from Surah Al-Rum.
Yes.
بينهم مودة ورحمة, the coupling
Yes.
of mercy and affection. I don't know whether I read it or I heard it from a scholar talking about why rahmah was necessary to add to affection, because usually people think of marriage, relationship with wife, one with husband, it's the love, it's what keeps things going, but sometimes these ups and downs require rahmah, requires the understanding of the other, that I have mercy. Just like we related the story with Hamdi, right?
Yes.
Yes. It's very important to keep that in mind. Because usually, especially Western societies, the increase in divorce and marriage problems, it's not that we don't have them, but the reason for that, it is this lack of rahmah.
That's true.
We expect roses all over,
Yes.
and then when those roses do not exist anymore, guess what, the rahmah, we never knew it, so it doesn't exist, and things fall apart.
Yes, that's a very good point, Dr.
Okay.
Muhammad. Excellent, Jazakallah khair. And it's perfect timing. It's 8:30, so if we can break for Salat al-Maghrib, and then, like I said, if you need to go, I totally understand, but if you can stay, we have a little bit more that I wanted to cover, which actually the next part is all about the marriage. So, if you want to take a break for Salah, we can go to the other room maybe. Dr. Muhammad?
Same place? For the-
Yeah, I think, yeah, let's go to some place.